My name is Morgan Wasserman, and I'm going to be reviewing Sidman Chapter 11. This chapter is called Neurosis and Mental Illness, and it discusses that we use avoidance and that a lot of our behavior patterns come into existence because we're trying to protect ourselves from anxieties that coercion invokes. We use avoidance and escape as a coping mechanism. They discuss avoidance contingencies in relation to what supports maladaptive behaviors. The chapter discusses phobias first as being not things that we have, but instead names that summarize behaviors. So in order to say that someone has a phobia, we look at the absence of actions, like if they have a social phobia, and then do not join social organizations or eat in restaurants. We also look at actions that occur more than what is to be expected, like the same person running from a group that they see on the street. These behaviors lead us to suspect a history of punishment, and even if the person is unaware of the history that led them to this particular behavior or phobia, it's still evident that there are anxiety-inducing factors that cause these behaviors. Avoidance, even if originally effective and purposeful because of these phobias, can become unnecessary if practiced over time, and then these behaviors are learned and not necessarily necessary or purposeful. So this leads into systematic desensitization, where a therapist can teach a child or person over time not to respond to stimuli as if it's aversive. So after this, the chapter discusses reaction formation, where we do the opposite of something we're told not to do to keep ourselves from doing the forbidden behavior. An example of this is when we're scolded, we might then go hug a parent and provide affection. Instead of doing the opposite of that behavior, we can also engage in sublimation. So we can do similar things that are acceptable. An example of this in the book was playing with clay instead of feces, which I think is gross, but it's a good example. We find socially approved outlets. So instead of playing with these feces, we say, okay, you can kind of do a similar thing, but instead now you need to play with this clay. We also use projection, where we engage in a behavior that made us afraid when someone else did it to us. And then we also use displacement, which is when we direct our bad behavior towards someone who we think isn't going to punish us. So an example of this from the chapter was when a child hit his dog after realizing that he couldn't get his new baby sister out of the picture. So he wanted to get somebody out of the picture, so he was able to hit his dog instead. So he kind of displaced that anger. We then move on to discussing aggression, which is when we revert back to a defense mechanism or a way we once behaved. The intent behind this is to avoid something aversive. So when it comes to obsessions and compulsions, we can view these as a way to do something in a repetitive manner, so that the wanted outcome is likely to occur. So the chapter discusses that if we look at the consequences of compulsive acts, we can see why these compulsions or obsessions continue to exist. Conversion disorders, like hypochondria, for example, where you think you have all these illnesses and frequently go to the doctor, most likely, provide people with a way to avoid aversive things like illnesses and relieve someone from responsibilities. So it was discussing how, maybe when you go blind, then you won't have to drive. I know that's a very terrible way to look at things because maybe we think it wouldn't be great to go blind, but it does relieve you from those responsibilities, just like being deaf would relieve you from the responsibility of having to hear an annoying uncle or sounds you don't want. Personally, I remember seeing an episode on TV where there was a girl and a guy on a date, and the boy was deaf and the girl was not, and she heard him saying, wow, this is so romantic, or he signed this to her, and she looks around and they turn on the sound and there's cars in the background and there are sirens and it's really not that romantic for her. So things like being deaf, being blind can relieve someone from responsibilities that they might not otherwise want. When it comes to amnesia, fugue, and multiple personality disorders, we can also relate these to the general theme of the chapter, which was avoidance. So all of these things are figuring out, how do these illnesses relate into avoidance? How do we avoid certain things? And how do these mental illnesses allow us to get to a place where it might be beneficial or harmful, but simply we are engaging in avoidance? So we can inactivate certain things like our memory. So when it comes to amnesia, we forget things. We can't avoid them in this way. It's not necessarily beneficial in some instances. Maybe we don't want to forget our memories. Maybe it's not a good thing, especially, maybe it's an instance of trauma and you would like to remember your family and now you can't. But we can inactivate certain things to avoid them. One interesting thing to note is that in total amnesia, a lot of behavior remains. So while you might not necessarily remember things in general, you can still talk. So you do remember how to talk. Maybe you don't remember learning to talk, but you do remember how to talk. You still remember how to read. In many instances, you can reason, and you can do so many more things. So it's not necessarily that you forget everything. It's just memory, and then that means that we can still exist, but we don't have to be related or remember these things that we want to avoid. And then we can still function in certain ways. So after this whole discussion, there's a discussion about what is normal. So the chapter talks a lot about all these different avoidance techniques and illnesses, and I think it's important to highlight that many factors lead into mental illness, and no one can just decide to avoid things in a certain way. So it's not like the person with amnesia can say, hey, I want amnesia, or the person with hypochondria can say, I want to be a hypochondriac. There are so many different things that factor into this. In general, abnormality can be valuable, or at the very least, it can be different without being harmful. So I think that that's important for a lot of us who are working with children with autism, because we need to accept these differences. It's not necessarily harmful to have autism, but it is different. So we don't necessarily need to view normal as right, but we do need to distinguish it from what we might consider to be abnormal. The book does say that the most effective treatment will always arise from an understanding of this normal state. So my question to you is related to this, because I don't necessarily agree with this. So I'm going to ask you, do you think that it is more important to understand normalcy or things that are abnormal? Most of us work with children on the autism spectrum or with other developmental delays. So do you think it's more important for us to understand typical levels of functioning so that our kids may work toward those levels of functioning? So if you consider the VB map, we say, okay, we need to know where they're falling so that we can know what the next step is, and we have very clear outlines for where they're supposed to go next. So that would be an understanding of typical levels of functioning. Or do you think it's more important to understand the nuance of our own children's behavior so that we may work with them? So something like that might be techniques related to verbal perseveration, or, how might we assist somebody who has particular interests or phobias so that they can enjoy what they're doing. So simplified, do you think that it's more important to understand normalcy, or do you think it's more important to understand abnormalcy or things that are not normal?